David Cameron aside, one of the key players throughout this was his communications director, Craig Oliver, recently knighted. He has just published his account of those hectic months, which he has called Unleashing Demons, a very good title. Craig, or is it Sir Craig?
It is Sir Craig, but I'm very happy for you to call me Craig.
OK, so I only ask because, Sir Craig, people seem to be sometimes quite squeamish about actually using titles that they get. I mean, they're given an honour and then they're a bit, as I say, squeamish about it. I'm
not squeamish about it. It's just one of those things. I mean, somebody said in the press this week, why isn't Sir on the title of your book?
I wondered that.
For example, Sir Alex Ferguson didn't use it on his title, and I'm told by the publishers the thought never really occurred to me, to be honest.
One of the things that comes out of that period that you've described in the book, and the book itself, unmistakably and unavoidably, is dishonesty. And there are 3 examples where the regime, the government, was dishonest, I would say, and I'd like to put them to you, and they come directly from your book. The first one is when Cameron said again and again and again that under different circumstances he might lead a Leave Europe campaign. He might be in charge of the Leave campaign, get us out. Reading your book, that is completely inconceivable. And in fact, even before the negotiations had started, you and he were organising what was going to become the Remain campaign.
I don't think it was inconceivable. I think there were points during the previous to the renegotiation where David Cameron was incredibly frustrated with Europe. The big question for David Cameron was, is this an organisation that's capable of change? Now, that only emerged over time, and he was only able to see that over time. And also, I think what you've got to remember about this period as well is during that period, business leaders, economists were coming out with more and more reports saying they were concerned about this. So actually, you can't see it as just a simple, I'm here now and now I'm there. It was across a spectrum over time.
Another example of which I think a more direct one perhaps is that David Cameron came onto this programme and sat on the sofa, and I asked him directly, if you lose, will you stay on as Prime Minister? And he looked me in the eye and he looked at the TV camera and he said, yes, definitely. And you were reinforcing that message too, and that was always nonsense, wasn't it?
Well, you were asking him to speculate about his future, and what
Absolutely.
he did was he answered the question at the time. Now, the reality is you can only judge circumstances as they actually happen. And when you approach those circumstances and you come to that moment, he took the decision that actually it wouldn't be the right thing for him to do. But I think to hold him to account for something that he said just a few weeks before, when actually the reality of the situation was impacting on him, was very different.
But you describe in the book, you say in the book, in his heart, there were almost no circumstances in which he would stay, and yet he was saying publicly that he would stay. It's a simple thing, but it is a direct dishonesty.
I'm describing... No, I don't think so, Andrew. I'm describing the moment where he is facing defeat and where he has learned that he is defeated. And I'm describing the moment that in his heart he knew at that moment that that he couldn't stay on. We discussed it, we thought about it, but the reality is only when you face those moments, and I think that's a very human thing.
So you think that when I asked him that, he thought he could stay on and would stay on as Prime Minister?
I think he thought that there were circumstances where he could stay on. And the reality of answering that question is, had he said, I will leave, at that moment, that would have set all sorts of hairs running at that moment. But he did believe that there were possible circumstances where if he lost, he could stay on.
This is what feeds cynicism about politics. You know, politicians are asked direct questions and don't give honest, direct answers.
They give honest, direct answers that are correct at the time. And I think the reality is he's a human being who was faced by the reality of loss at that time. And it's only at that moment that you can truly know.
OK, a third example seemed to me when Boris Johnson suddenly announced that he was going to be involved in the Leave campaign. We were all told by Downing Street that he had only 9 minutes or previously, I think, sent a text to the Prime Minister telling him what he was going to do. And to many of us, that seemed really bad behaviour and coloured our view of Boris Johnson for a long time afterwards. It turns out from your book that wasn't the case, that he'd been sending texts and emails to the Prime Minister about his agonising choice for some time beforehand.
Well, let me describe in detail exactly what happened with Boris, just to clear that up. When we came back from the renegotiation on the morning, we were discussing what David Cameron was going to say in the Cabinet, and there was a ping on his BlackBerry, and he stopped for a moment, he put his elbows on his knees, his glasses were on the edge of his nose, and he looked at his BlackBerry, and he spent some time reading the message, and he looked up and said, "It's out." And we all knew at that moment he was talking about Boris. And then he went through what was a very well-argued, very human message saying how Boris had reached that conclusion.
I've been agonising about it.
Exactly. 4 hours later, I received a phone call from David Cameron saying, you haven't said anything about Boris saying he's out, have you? And I hadn't, because I didn't think it was appropriate to reveal that at that time. But what David Cameron was saying was Boris was at that point saying he could be reconsidering, and he wasn't so sure. So actually, we were in a period of not knowing which way Boris was actually going to go until 9 minutes before. The final confirmation came 9 minutes before. We could have revealed the extent to which Boris was wobbling all over the place like a wonky shopping trolley, as he described it himself, but we chose not to, and I think that actually was an honourable thing to do, not questionable as you put it.
Except that it made it look as if he had kept the Prime Minister in the dark all the way through until the last minute, and then dropped him in it.
But let me ask you, which would have been better, that we'd revealed at that point that he was sending texts to the Prime Minister that he was that he was all over the place? I don't think Boris would have thanked us for that.
OK, let's turn to the guy who is the villain of your book, Michael Gove. You're very, very hard on Michael Gove. You call him a destructive game player whose behaviour was shameful. He suffers from poison. He spread poison. He suffers from a vaulting ambition and a preparedness to mislead. Isn't the truth about Michael Gove that actually he realised what the British people thought? He could see very clearly he had a principled position against the EU right from the beginning, which the rest of you didn't have, and that he was right and you were all wrong.
Well, look, I think we did have principled positions for a start. I'm not questioning the fact that Michael Gove is a Eurosceptic. That's absolutely right, and it's a perfectly legitimate position. I respect that. But let's look at some of the things that happened and why I describe him that way. 2 days before he announced that he was going to be chair of the Leave campaign, he told the Prime Minister he wouldn't play a leading role in that. When he was leading that campaign, that was setting itself up almost as an alternative government. It was questioning policies that were only tangentially related to Europe, the NHS, the national living wage.
You saw a coup coming, in short.
He questioned the integrity of the Prime Minister, saying that he was corroding public trust. Now, that was concerning to us and was not behaviour that we necessarily expected from him.
Let's ask about Theresa May in your book, because she appears on the edges of the story again and again and again. You describe her as a submarine under the waters. You're never quite sure which way she's going to jump. Somebody at one point says, we're not even sure if she's working for the other side, if she's a double agent.
That was Will Straw.
That's Will Straw. But you're pretty negative about her all the way through. Isn't the truth that actually, again, she saw it better than you guys did, that she wanted to put out a statement saying that she didn't want to insult people's intelligence, she said, by claiming that everything about the EU is perfect, that membership of the EU is wholly good, or that the sky will fall in if we vote to leave. And you wouldn't let her say that.
No, what I was perfectly happy for Theresa May to do was to express her opinions and say what was right, and she was sincere in those, and that's acceptable. What I'm simply describing in the book is what was it like to be in the middle of this tumultuous campaign. Now, it was very difficult in the lead-up to that campaign, having a Home Secretary not reveal which side she was on. When she did reveal what side she was on, it was 51-49, and was very equivocal, and that was difficult.
It's perfect.
I think we're agreeing with each other, Andrew.
Okay.
It's perfectly legitimate for Theresa May to do that. What the book is doing is recounting what was it like being in Downing Street to be part of this tumultuous situation.
And in that story, again and again and again, you're very, very angry about what you call the lies of the Leave side. And the behaviour of the media swallowing these lies, including the BBC not challenging them enough. And yet, from your point of view, your side, there were terrible things were said which turned out not to be true. Above all, the punishment budget. We were going to have an absolutely ferocious budget if we voted to leave. Now, we know that's not true because it hasn't happened.
Well, let's take two things in there. You're saying about the Leave campaign. The Leave campaign was prepared to say that we spend £350 million a week on the EU, which could go to the NHS. Not true. There is going to be an EU army and Britain will be forced to join it. Turkey
might be true.
Britain is going to be forced to join an EU army? That's not true. Turkey is joining the EU in the next few years and millions of people will come to this country.
What about your side?
That is not true. So, no, I'm dealing with that point. You put that point to me. In terms of our side, let's talk about what was called the punishment budget. What George Osborne was trying to do there was say independent economic experts were saying there's going to be a £30 to £40 billion black hole in our economy. Now, you can deal with that by raising taxes, you can cut public spending, or you can raise borrowing. And he said that come the... No, what he's
still there.
Well, look, nothing has happened yet. We are still members of the EU on the same terms that we were on the 23rd of June. But I would point out to the fact that, yes, there has been some good economic news, but we've also seen the currency drop 15% from peak. We've had growth forecasts next year downgraded. And we've also, interestingly, had the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying he's going to reset fiscal policy. Now, that sounds like a lot more borrowing to me. Let's wait and see. And let's find out what happens at the end of this process.
Anyway, Sir Craig, very interesting book. Thanks so much for joining us today.